She was blind from birth and lived in poverty. Her mother considered her a curse and one day sold her own daughter to a stranger for money. The girl found herself in a luxurious house full of secrets and silence. On her first night, everything changed. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what city you're from. In a forgotten corner of the city, where buildings leaned tiredly against one another and the streets reeked of old oil and desperation, a child was born in silence. The air was thick with humidity, the sky hanging low and dull, as though it too bore the weight of something unspoken. In a crumbling two-room shack surrounded by heaps of rusted metal and peeling wood, a girl came into the world without a cry. Her skin was dark as polished mahogany, smooth and warm. But her eyes, though open, saw nothing. The woman who birthed her, named Lorraine, looked down at the infant and felt no flicker of love. The silence of the newborn wasn't comforting, it was ominous. She waited for the scream, the wail, the proof of life. When none came, she cursed under her breath. A nurse in the overcrowded public clinic leaned in, examined the child, and said gently, "She's alive. Just quiet." But Lorraine already knew something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. Weeks later, a doctor confirmed it. The child was blind. Lorraine sat on a plastic chair in the hospital corridor, staring at the floor as the doctor spoke. The child, now named Aisha, had no visible trauma, no genetic markers that could explain her condition. "It may be neurological," the doctor said. "There is always the chance of improvement. Sometimes, with time, the brain compensates." But Lorraine didn't hear the possibilities. She only heard the failure. A blind daughter was a curse, not a child. A blind daughter would never be beautiful, never bring riches, never marry well. And Lorraine, who had once been known as the most radiant girl on her block, had not escaped poverty to become the mother of a cripple. She left the hospital in silence, carrying Aisha wrapped in an old blanket, not bothering to look at her. The infant's head rested against her mother's chest, absorbing a heartbeat that beat not with love, but with bitterness. The house in which they lived was no home. Its walls, warped and leaning, had absorbed decades of dampness and grief. The floorboards were split and uneven, and in winter cruel winds threaded their way through the gaps like fingers searching for warmth to steal. Lorraine worked when she could, odd jobs, cleaning, sometimes dancing in a smoky bar at the edge of town. But the money was never enough. Food was sparse, and nights were long and cold. Aisha grew in silence, learning early not to cry because crying brought no comfort. Lorraine gave her nothing but the essentials. There were no bedtime stories, no lullabies, no gentle hands to brush her curls. The child learned to bathe herself by feel, to navigate the small, cluttered rooms by memorizing the placement of every object. She heard the rats scuttling in the walls, the neighbors fighting through the thin plywood. She smelled mildew, cigarettes, and the sour breath of hunger. But the worst was the silence from her mother. Lorraine rarely spoke, and when she did, it was in clipped commands or low muttering. Aisha became fluent in the language of silence. As she grew, her features began to sharpen. Her face, though unseen by herself, was striking. High cheekbones, full lips, a natural symmetry that others noticed even if she could not. Her hair coiled in rich spirals down her back, and her skin, unmarred and luminous, held a softness that seemed at odds with her surroundings. Strangers sometimes remarked on her beauty in passing, but Lorraine waved it off. What use was beauty if the girl couldn't even see? Aisha didn't know what beauty meant. She only knew she was different. Children avoided her. She could hear their whispers, their snickering. At school, if she ever made it there, she sat alone. She had no friends, no books in Braille, no tools to guide her. But she had her mind, and it wandered. She imagined gardens with warm sunlight and flowers she could smell but not name. She imagined music drifting through open windows. In her head, she created spaces where she was not alone. Lorraine, meanwhile, grew older and harder. The lines on her face deepened, and the bitterness in her voice sharpened. She looked around her neighborhood and saw younger women rising. Some had married rich men, some had escaped to other cities. But she remained, trapped by a daughter she never wanted, a ghost of the beauty she once wielded like a weapon. One night, when Aisha was 16, Lorraine sat outside the house on a broken lawn chair, smoking a cigarette as the sun bled into the horizon. A man in a suit, sharp, too clean for this part of town, approached. He spoke softly, cautiously, but his words carried weight. He worked for a man, he said. A very wealthy man. An old man. He was looking for something, not love, not companionship. Just someone quiet, obedient, a presence. A wife by legal terms, but not in spirit. Lorraine listened, her eyes narrow, heart thudding. She laughed once, dryly, and then gestured toward the house. "I have just a thing," she said. "Pretty face, won't talk back, blind as a bat." The man didn't flinch. He nodded. That might do. They spoke for a long time. Numbers were mentioned, arrangements. Lorraine leaned back and smiled for the first time in years. The money was enough to leave this place, enough to start over. Inside, Aisha sat on the floor near the broken radiator, feeling the cool metal against her arm. She had heard her mother talking to someone, but the words were distant. The tone, however, she recognized, calculated, focused. Lorraine never sounded like that unless she was getting something she wanted. Over the following days, Lorraine was different. She cooked, she cleaned. She even bought Aisha a new dress, plain but whole. The gesture confused the girl. She didn't know how to respond. She sat still as her mother brushed her hair for the first time in memory, pulling through the tangles with more force than needed, but without anger. Aisha remained silent. The morning of the departure came. Aisha was told she'd be going on a trip, that someone important wanted to meet her. Lorraine's voice was flat, unreadable. Aisha dressed in the clothes laid out for her and waited. Her hands trembled slightly. A black car arrived. Aisha was led outside and felt the warmth of the sun on her face, the weight of goodbye in the silence behind her. Lorraine did not hug her, did not say farewell. She simply closed the door and vanished back inside. The man from before guided her into the car. She sat on smooth leather seats, inhaling a scent she couldn't place. Clean, expensive, foreign. The engine purred to life. Aisha didn't speak. She had learned long ago that silence was safest, but in her chest, her heart beat faster than it ever had. As the city fell away behind her, Aisha pressed her fingers against the glass, feeling the vibrations of speed and distance. She didn't know where she was going or why, but somewhere beneath the fear, something unfamiliar stirred. A question, faint and fragile. What if something could change? What if this was not an end but a beginning? And for the first time in her young life, she dared, just barely, to hope. The car moved smoothly, gliding over streets that Aisha could not see but could feel in the subtle changes of the road beneath her. She sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, fingers nervously tracing the seams of her dress. The air inside the car was cool and carried the faint scent of leather and something sweet, polished wood maybe, or expensive cologne. Beside her, the man who had come for her remained silent, his presence quiet but unwavering. Aisha didn't speak. She had learned from childhood that silence was safer than questions. As the city's noise faded behind them, replaced by a low hum of tires on asphalt, her mind circled restlessly. She knew without needing to be told that her life had changed the moment she stepped into this car. The house she had left, the peel-in paint, the damp mattress, her mother's distant voice felt impossibly far away, like a place from someone else's dream. She didn't know where she was being taken or why, and that not knowing felt heavier than the air around her. Time slipped by without measure. She felt the car slow, the road change texture beneath them, gravel crunching now instead of smooth pavement. The car finally stopped, and the man spoke for the first time since they had begun the journey. "We're here." Aisha's pulse quickened. She reached for the door handle, but before her fingers could find it, the door opened from the outside. A gentle hand guided her out, firm but not rough. She stepped onto a driveway that felt too clean beneath her worn shoes, smelled too fresh to belong anywhere near the city. The man's voice again. "There are steps ahead. Let me help you." She allowed herself to be led. The air smelled of flowers she couldn't name, of trimmed grass and something sweetly unfamiliar. As they walked, she heard the faint rustle of trees, the soft splash of distant water, the chirp of birds. All sounds she knew, but not like this, not wrapped in stillness and order. They stopped. She could feel it in the pause of movement, in the shift of the man's posture beside her. "Wait here." He walked away, leaving her standing alone. Aisha's fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. She felt the sun on her face, warm and steady. Somewhere, far away, a door opened and closed. Minutes passed, or maybe more. Then footsteps returned. Several pairs, not just one. She straightened instinctively, bracing herself. A new voice, colder, older, male, spoke without preamble. "Is this her?" "Yes," the man replied. A pause, the sound of shoes shifting on stone. Aisha imagined eyes studying her, assessing her like a piece of furniture or a stray dog. "She is young," the cold voice said at last. "Pretty, but blind." "She is obedient," the other man replied, "and quiet." A sound of papers rustling, the scraping of a pen. Aisha stood motionless, her heart hammering against her ribs as the men spoke over her, as though she weren't there. She couldn't understand all the words, but she understood enough. Money, signatures, ownership. Then came a moment of silence that stretched too long. Finally, footsteps approached again. The man who had brought her leaned close. "It's done." Before she could react, she felt fingers at her elbow, guiding her back toward the car. She hesitated, instinctively turning her head back toward the place where she had heard the other man. But there was no farewell, no acknowledgement of her presence. She was being moved like a package. The drive continued, and though she could not see the shifting landscape beyond the windows, she sensed that they were leaving the city far behind. The roads grew quieter. The air changed. She smelled fields, trees, open spaces. Hours passed in silence. Eventually, the car slowed again. The man spoke softly. "This is your new home." Aisha's heart tightened. She felt the car stop completely, the engine hum fading to stillness. The door opened, and she was helped out once more. The ground beneath her feet was smooth stone. She smelled flowers again, roses, maybe, or something like them, and the faint trace of water. The air was clean in a way she had never known, crisp and fragrant. A door opened. Voices murmured. The man guided her forward into cool shade. The temperature shifted as they crossed a threshold. She heard footsteps echoing off high ceilings, felt the cavernous space around her. The air smelled faintly of old wood, polished marble, something sweet like vanilla. "This is the main hall," the man said, almost kindly now. "You'll learn it in time." They walked slowly. Aisha tried to memorize the turns, the texture of the floors beneath her shoes, the direction of sound. She could hear more voices now, soft, respectful, distant, not like the shouts and curses she had grown up with. Finally, they stopped. A pause. The man's voice again, softer. "He wants to see you." Aisha didn't ask who. She knew. Another pair of footsteps approached, measured and slow. She felt the weight of another presence standing before her, silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the voice she recognized from earlier, the cold one, broke the silence. "You are Aisha." She nodded. "You are here now," he continued, his voice flat. "You will live here. You will have everything you need. Food, clothing, a room of your own. You will be safe." Another pause. "You are my wife. In name only. That is all." Aisha swallowed, her throat tight. She didn't understand. None of this made sense. The man's voice softened, barely. "I expect nothing from you. You're here because I need someone. That is all." Footsteps receded. The man who had brought her remained by her side. "You'll be taken to your room now." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Aisha was led through endless hallways, up wide staircases, past closed doors. She tried to memorize everything. The sound of her footsteps on different surfaces, the scent of fresh linens in the air, the distant murmur of staff moving through the house. Her room was large, far larger than the tiny space she had slept in all her life. It smelled clean, of fresh wood and flowers. The bed was soft when she sat on it, the sheets smooth beneath her fingers. There was a window. She could feel the warmth of sunlight on her skin, but she had no need to look. The man who had brought her finally left, and she was alone. Aisha sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She did not cry. She did not speak. For the first time in her life, she realized that her mother was truly gone. Not dead, but absent, vanished from her world without a word. She had always known her mother's voice would not comfort her, but it had been a presence, however cold. Now, even that was gone. Night fell. Someone came to bring her food, but she barely touched it. She lay on the bed, listening to the silence of this strange, cavernous house. The absence of noise was louder than any scream. As sleep crept over her, one thought lingered in her mind, a question without answer. What kind of man bought a wife he did not want? And why her? The answer would not come that night, but it hovered in the air, heavy and inevitable, like the first crack of thunder before a storm. The first days in the house passed like a dream from which Aisha could not wake. Everything felt unreal, too quiet, too clean, too large to belong to the world she had known. She moved through the corridors like a shadow, careful and uncertain, her hands trailing along cold marble walls or polished wooden railings to map the invisible world around her. Every sound echoed in these spaces, the distant footsteps of the staff, the occasional murmur of voices, the soft rustle of curtains shifting in a breeze she could not feel. No one spoke to her unless necessary. The people who moved around her were courteous but distant, as if she were an object that needed care but not conversation. When she asked a question, the answers were brief, polite, and devoid of emotion. She soon stopped asking. It reminded her too much of how she had lived before, unseen, unheard, a fixture in the background of other people's lives. Her room was large and spotless. She had never imagined such a space could exist for her. The bed was soft, the sheets cool and fragrant, the wardrobe full of clothes she had not chosen. There were flowers on a small table by the window. The air smelled of something sweet and light, a scent that clung to the corners of the room like a promise she did not understand. But none of it felt like home. It was all too foreign, too quiet, too empty. On the second evening, the man who had brought her to the house came to her room. He knocked softly before entering, his voice low as always. "He wishes to see you." Aisha rose without a word, smoothing the skirt of the dress she had been given. She followed him down the winding hallways, counting steps, memorizing the sound of each surface beneath her feet. Marble in the main hall, carpet on the stairs, cool wood near the doorways. They entered a room that smelled of old books and leather, the air heavier here as if filled with things unspoken. She heard the faint crackle of a fireplace, the soft shifting of someone seated. "You may leave," a voice said quietly. The man at her side stepped away, and she stood alone. For a long moment there was silence. Then the voice again, deeper this time, worn at the edges like old parchment. "You are adjusting." It was not a question, but she nodded anyway. "You may speak freely," he added after a pause. Her throat felt tight. She searched for words, but they were slow to come. "Yes," she said finally, "I am learning." The man, her husband, though the word meant nothing to her, did not respond immediately. She listened instead to the quiet rasp of his breath, the subtle weight of his presence. "You need not fear this place," he said at last. "No one here will harm you." The words were simple, but they fell heavily between them. Aisha said nothing. She did not know how to explain that it wasn't harm she feared, but the hollow space inside her, the absence of anything to hold on to. He dismissed her soon after, his voice low and even. She returned to her room and sat by the window, listening to the wind brushing against the glass, wondering why a man who seemed to want nothing would go to such lengths to bring her here. Days became weeks. Each morning, she was woken gently by a maid who brought her breakfast and asked if she needed anything. Each afternoon, she walked the halls alone, mapping them with her steps and fingertips. The house was a maze of vast rooms, tall ceilings, and wide, empty spaces. The floors were cool beneath her feet. The air always smelled faintly of flowers and something older, something that lingered in the wood and stone. The staff moved around her like ghosts, careful and efficient. She learned their rhythms, the cook who hummed to herself in the mornings, the gardener who spoke softly to the flowers outside, the maid whose footsteps were light and quick. None of them spoke of the master of the house. His presence hovered like a shadow behind every closed door. It was not until the third week that Aisha began to notice the changes. One morning, as she walked past the grand staircase, she heard music. Soft, tentative notes drifting from a room she had never entered. She paused, listening. The melody was unfamiliar, hesitant, but beautiful. For a moment, she stood frozen, the sound pulling at something inside her she had forgotten she possessed. The music stopped abruptly. She moved away before anyone could notice her. Later that evening, she sat in her room and wondered who had played. The house seemed too quiet, too still for such things, but the memory of the notes lingered. The next day, she asked the maid about the music. The woman hesitated before answering. "The piano," she said quietly, "in the west wing." Aisha wanted to ask more, but the maid did not linger. She began walking toward the west wing during her daily explorations, learning the path, the distance, the sounds. One afternoon, She paused outside the door where she knew the piano to be. She placed her hand on the cool wood, listening. Silence. She did not enter. She only stood there, feeling the stillness on the other side. In the evenings, she took to sitting by her window, listening to the breeze, the occasional sound of footsteps on the gravel outside, the faint hum of life beyond the walls. Sometimes she thought she could hear the piano again, faint and fleeting, like a memory just out of reach. The days folded into one another, each one quiet and measured. She was given everything she needed: food, clothing, a soft bed, but she was spoken to rarely. Her husband remained distant, present only in passing, a voice behind a door or at the end of a corridor. Then, one evening, everything shifted. A storm had rolled in during the afternoon, heavy rain beating against the windows, thunder rumbling low in the distance. Aisha stood by the fireplace in the sitting room, listening to the rhythm of the rain, when she heard footsteps behind her. "You're not afraid of storms?" the voice asked. She turned slightly. It was him. "No," she said quietly. He moved closer, though still at a distance. "They remind me of things," he murmured, almost to himself. She said nothing. For a moment, he stood there, silent. Then he spoke again. "Would you like to hear the piano?" She hesitated, then nodded. He led her to the west wing, his footsteps slow and careful so she could follow. The door creaked open, and she felt the cool air of the music room wash over her. The scent of polished wood, old paper, something faintly floral lingered there. He guided her to a chair near the piano, then sat at the instrument himself. She heard the soft shuffle of sheet music, the quiet clearing of his throat. When he began to play, the music was simple, hesitant, but there was something in it, a tenderness, a fragility that caught at her throat. She sat perfectly still, listening, feeling each note settle into the quiet spaces of her chest. When the song ended, he said nothing, and neither did she. But something had shifted between them, subtle and real. From that evening on, the house felt less empty. The silences were no longer hollow, but filled with the echoes of music, the sound of footsteps moving through familiar spaces, the faint warmth of something she could not yet name. Aisha began to walk more boldly through the halls, her fingers brushing the edges of furniture, the cool stone of the staircase, the smooth wood of the banisters. She listened for the music in the evenings, and when she heard it, she smiled. She was still a stranger in this place, still a shadow moving through rooms too large for her. But now, the silence no longer swallowed her whole, and though she did not know it yet, her presence had begun to change more than just the echoes in the halls. She had begun to change the man who lived behind the closed doors. The weeks that followed settled over the house like soft dust, silent but not stagnant. The air no longer felt so heavy in Aisha's chest, though the house remained as vast and cold as it had been the first day she arrived. Something intangible had shifted, like the faint scent of rain before a storm or the slow cracking of ice beneath warming sun. She moved now with a little more ease, her hands knowing the turns of the corridors, her feet counting the rhythm of steps over polished floors. The unfamiliar had begun to wear thin, revealing a quiet pattern beneath. The piano music had become a thread weaving through her days. It did not play every night, but often enough that she began to wait for it in the evenings, leaning against the windowsill in her room, listening. She could not see the rain tapping gently against the glass or the shadows stretching across the floor, but she felt them, sensed their presence as surely as she felt the music winding its way through the halls. She did not know what had changed in the man she now shared this house with, but she felt the change nonetheless. His footsteps no longer echoed like the tread of a stranger. Sometimes they paused near the doorway where she sat, though he rarely spoke. When he did, his voice had softened, the edges worn down like sea glass smoothed by years of waves. It was in one of those quiet evenings, when the house felt more like a memory than a prison, that she found herself lingering by the conservatory. She had begun walking there every afternoon, drawn by the scent of flowers and the warmth of sunlight filtering through tall glass panes she could not see. The gardener, a kind older man with slow, careful movements, never said much, but she could hear him tending to the roses, humming quietly under his breath. One afternoon, as she knelt to feel the damp soil beneath the rose bushes, she heard footsteps approaching. Not the light tread of the maid or the heavy steps of the gardener, but measured, deliberate. She rose slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. "You like the flowers," the man said. His voice still carried that same even tone, but something had shifted beneath it. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest trace of something warmer. "They smell beautiful," Aisha replied simply. He stood there for a moment, as if unsure whether to speak again, then said, "My wife once tended these." The words fell between them like an unexpected drop of rain. Aisha remained silent, sensing that he was not speaking to her so much as to himself. "She used to talk to them," he continued after a pause. "Said they grew better when someone spoke kindly." Aisha lowered her head, fingers trailing gently over the petals. Maybe they did. It became a rhythm after that. He would find her in the conservatory or near the west wing, sometimes offering a few words, sometimes only his presence. She did not question why. She knew what it was to crave the sound of another voice without needing the weight of conversation. The house felt different beneath this quiet shift. The staff moved with less stiffness. The hallways seemed less cavernous. And Asha herself began to change, though she did not notice it at first. She laughed one afternoon when the gardener's dog ran past her, its wet nose bumping against her hand unexpectedly. She asked the maid to read her a book one evening, and though her voice stumbled awkwardly over the words, Aisha listened with quiet attention. The silences between the walls no longer felt like chains, but like spaces waiting to be filled. It was during one of these afternoons, sitting in the conservatory with the sound of bees humming faintly beyond the glass, that she first heard whispers from the staff, words spoken when they thought she was too far away to hear. "She's different," one voice murmured. "The master is different too," another answered. Aisha said nothing, but the words lingered in her mind long after. One evening, long after the household had quieted, Aisha sat near the fireplace in her room, fingers tracing the carved patterns along the wooden arm of her chair. She had grown used to the hush of the house at night, but tonight something felt different. A tension in the air, a ripple beneath the calm. The sound of footsteps drew her attention. Not hurried, but heavier than usual. She listened closely as they passed her door, then faded down the hall. The next morning, the maid's voice was subdued when she brought Aisha her tea. "The master's unwell today," she said quietly. Aisha felt a tightness bloom in her chest that she did not understand. She nodded without speaking, but the taste of the tea felt bitter on her tongue. Days passed. She heard less movement in the halls, fewer notes from the piano. The staff grew quieter, their footsteps slower. The house felt heavier again, not with coldness this time, but with something closer to worry. One afternoon, as she walked toward the west wing, she paused outside the music room. The door was ajar. She could hear faint breathing inside, strained and uneven. She knocked gently. "Come in." His voice was rough, worn thinner than she had ever heard it. She stepped inside, moving carefully to where she knew the chair by the piano stood. She could hear him seated there, the sound of a paper rustling beneath his hand. "You are ill," she said softly, a pause. "I've always been ill," he replied after a moment, "but lately the weight of it grows heavier." Aisha folded her hands together tightly. She did not know what to say, but her heart thudded painfully in her chest. "I heard you speaking to the gardener last week," he continued, "about the roses." She nodded, unsure why he mentioned it. "I thought you might like to know," he said quietly. "There are doctors who believe your sight could be restored." The words struck her like cold water. She felt the breath catch in her throat. "No one told me," she said at last. "No one thought to," he replied simply. "Until now." Silence fell between them, thick and tangled. "Why now?" she asked. He hesitated, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "Because you deserve to see." Her throat tightened painfully. She shook her head, unsure how to hold the weight of what he had given her. "Think about it," he said. She left the music room that day with her thoughts in turmoil, her steps uneven. The house seemed larger again, the walls pressing close, the ceilings too high. She spent that night awake, listening to the wind rattling faintly against the windows, her mind circling the question he had placed in her hands. The days that followed passed in a haze. The staff moved around her gently, their voices lower. She heard footsteps outside her room at odd hours. Doctors, she guessed, though no one spoke of it directly. One evening, as she sat in the conservatory with her fingers buried in the soil, she heard his footsteps behind her. "You've thought about it," he said without preamble. She nodded. "Do you want it?" She swallowed, her throat dry. "I don't know." He sat beside her, the first time he had done so in all these weeks. "It will change everything," he said quietly, "but not who you are." She turned her head toward him, sensing the truth in his words. "Why do you care?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. "Because I brought you here," he said at last, "and because I see you." The words settled into her chest like a stone sinking slowly beneath water. That night, she lay awake long after the household had quieted, her mind turning over his words, the offer, the weight of choice. By morning, she knew her answer. The morning was unusually quiet. Even the air itself seemed to have paused, hovering uncertainly in the stillness that had settled over the house. Aisha awoke before the maid arrived, her eyes open but unseeing, her hands resting lightly on the cool fabric of her bedding. She lay there for a long time, listening to the sounds that had become familiar to her, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the whisper of wind against the glass, the distant hum of footsteps moving somewhere beyond her door. But this morning, everything felt different. Waited. When the maid did finally arrive with her tray, Aisha's voice was calm and steady. "Tell him I will do it," she said. The maid paused only briefly, then nodded and left without a word. Aisha sat upright, her fingers absently tracing the embroidery on the edge of the sheet. She felt neither fear nor relief in that moment, only an odd kind of clarity, as if a thread that had been winding around her heart had finally been pulled free. She did not know what would come next, whether the world beyond her blindness would embrace her or overwhelm her, but she knew she could not stay suspended in shadows forever. The days that followed moved quickly, filled with preparations and quiet conversations behind closed doors. She could hear the difference in the staff's footsteps now, a mixture of tension and anticipation, hushed voices exchanging fragments of information she could not fully grasp. The air itself seemed charged, like the moments before a storm breaks. He came to see her more often during those days. He no longer lingered in the shadows, but walked into her room, his presence calm but solid, like a figure carved out of the very walls of the house. They spoke little, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty, but filled with something weightier, understanding, perhaps, or something close to it. One evening, as the last of the sunlight faded beyond the window, she asked him the question that had been resting on her tongue for days. "Why did you choose me?" He sat across from her, his hands resting loosely on the armrests of the chair, and for a long moment he said nothing. "Because you were the only one who didn't ask to be here," he said at last, "and because I thought you would never look at me the way everyone else does." Aisha listened to the truth in his voice, the weariness beneath it, and said nothing. She understood what he meant. In her darkness, she had never seen the lines on his face, the illness in his eyes, the weight of years pressing down on him. She had never looked at him the way the world did. The day of the procedure arrived quietly. There was no ceremony, no grand announcement. A black car waited at the entrance of the house, its engine idling softly as the staff moved like shadows around it, loading small bags and necessary things. Aisha stood at the top of the steps, her fingers lightly brushing the smooth wooden banister. He approached her then, his footsteps measured, steady despite the heaviness she could hear in his breath. "You're ready," he said. She nodded. He took her arm, not roughly, but carefully, like someone carrying something fragile, and guided her down the steps. The car door opened. She sat inside without hesitation. The drive was long and quiet. She could hear the muted hum of the engine, the occasional sound of tires slipping over wet pavement. He sat beside her, saying nothing, his presence like a solid weight beside her. She could feel his gaze on her now and then, but he did not speak. The hospital was nothing like the ones she had known in childhood. There were no sharp smells of antiseptic, no frantic voices or crowded waiting rooms. It was quiet, efficient, almost luxurious in its sterile calm. The doctors spoke to her in soft voices, their hands gentle as they guided her through examinations and procedures. She understood very little of the technical language they used, but she could hear the careful hope in their tones, the cautious promise that this could work. When they left her alone in the small room before the surgery, he sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, she broke the silence. "If it works," she said, her voice low, "what will change?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Everything," he said, "and nothing." She thought she understood. The moments before she was taken into surgery felt stretched thin, suspended like the hush before the fall of a curtain. She lay on the cool bed, the sterile smell of the room sharp in her nose, her heart beating steadily beneath her ribs. The doctors moved around her quietly, explaining what would happen, but their words blurred at the edges of her mind. As they prepared the anesthesia, he stood at the edge of the room, his presence a calm anchor in the sterile white space. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She shook her head. "No." "Good." The last thing she felt before the darkness took her was his hand, warm and solid, closing gently over hers. When Aisha woke, the world was bright. Too bright, blinding, even through closed eyelids. She felt the heaviness in her limbs, the dull ache behind her eyes, the sterile smell of the hospital pressing against her skin. The nurses moved around her, their voices soft and careful. She could hear the edges of excitement in their tones, the cautious optimism. She kept her eyes closed, not ready to face whatever waited beyond. He was there when they left, his breathing steady beside her bed. "You can open them when you're ready," he said. It was not until evening, when the room had grown quiet and the light softened against her eyelids, that she finally did. The world rushed at her all at once, shapes and colors and brightness that made her gasp and flinch. Everything was too sharp, too much. She pressed her hands against her face, trying to hold herself together. He said nothing, simply sat there, waiting. Little by little, the world began to make sense. The colors blurred into forms, the brightness softened into shapes. She saw the walls of the room, the window beyond, the vase of flowers on the table. And him, sitting quietly beside her, his face lined and weary, his eyes tired but clear. He did not smile. He simply watched her, waiting. She took in the details slowly, the silver in his hair, the hollows beneath his eyes, the fragile way his hands rested on his knees. He looked nothing like the man she had imagined in the darkness. And yet, in that moment, she understood that it did not matter. The next days were difficult. Every sight felt like a flood, every shape too sharp, every color too bright. She spent hours in quiet rooms with doctors, learning how to interpret what her eyes told her, how to move in a world she had never seen. But every evening, when the noise and brightness became too much, he was there. He did not speak much, but his presence was steady, a quiet reminder of the space she had carved for herself in the world. One afternoon, as she sat by the window in her hospital room, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze, he sat beside her and spoke. "When you are ready," he said, "we will go home." She turned to look at him, really look at him, for the first time. The years on his face, the illness in his body, the weight of a life lived mostly in shadow. "I am ready," she said. They returned to the house together, the journey quieter than the one that had first brought her there. She sat beside him in the car, her eyes open now, watching the world unfold around her like a story she had only heard in fragments. When they arrived, the house felt different. Smaller, perhaps, or maybe simply less empty. She walked through the halls slowly, relearning the spaces she had once only known by sound and touch. The staff greeted her quietly, their faces cautious but kind. That evening, she sat in the music room, her fingers tracing the smooth edge of the piano keys. She turned when she heard him enter. "I never asked," she said softly. "Why the piano?" He sat across from her, his posture slightly hunched, his breath slower than before. "My wife used to play," he said. "Before." Aisha nodded, understanding more in that one word than he had ever told her. She placed her fingers on the keys and pressed down, letting a single note linger in the air. The sound was soft, clear, and new, like everything else. The house felt quieter than she remembered. Not the heavy, suffocating quiet of her first weeks within its walls, nor the brittle silence that had followed her mother's voice all her life. This was a quieter kind of stillness, a hush that settled gently over every corner, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Aisha moved through the halls slowly now, her footsteps measured not out of fear, but because she was learning the house all over again. Her eyes wandered constantly, drawn to the smallest things, the intricate carvings along the banister, the pale thread of cracks running like veins across the marble tiles, the flicker of candlelight dancing against the polished surface of a cabinet. She had known these walls by sound and texture, by the cold press of stone beneath her fingers, by the echo of footsteps against high ceilings. But now she saw them, and it was like seeing the face of someone whose voice she had heard her whole life without knowing their features. The days passed slowly, filled with discovery and disorientation. Sight had not come to her as the world promised in stories. It was not immediate clarity, no miraculous moment of beauty revealed. It was overwhelming, exhausting, sometimes painful. There were days when she retreated to her room, curtains drawn, eyes closed, longing for the familiar comfort of darkness. The brightness of the world pressed too close, too much to hold. But each morning she opened her eyes again. He gave her space, as he always had. He did not crowd her, did not fill the rooms with unnecessary words. But his presence lingered, quiet, constant, like a thread running through the fabric of the house. Sometimes she would find him sitting in the music room, his fingers resting lightly on the piano keys without pressing them down. Sometimes she glimpsed him in the garden, seated in the shade, watching the roses sway gently in the wind. The illness showed more clearly on him now. She had not seen it before in her blindness, though she had heard it in the weight of his breath, the weariness in his voice. Now she saw the lines etched deep around his eyes, the pallor beneath his skin, the faint tremor in his hands. It startled her at first, the fragility of the man who had seemed an immovable shadow in her life, but over time it stopped frightening her. It was simply another truth, one of many she was learning to see. It took weeks before she ventured outside for the first time since returning. The day was bright, too bright, the sky a sharp, endless blue that made her squint. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming flowers, and somewhere in the distance she heard the faint trickle of the fountain she had once only known by sound. She stood in the garden, her feet pressing into the gravel path, and turned her face to the sunlight. The roses she had tended with her hands all those months ago now unfolded before her eyes. Petals soft and curved, their colors richer than she could have imagined. She crouched down and touched one gently, tracing the shape she had memorized long before she could see it. It felt the same, but now she could watch her fingers move over the delicate edges, the soft tremble of the petals beneath her touch. He found her there that afternoon, his footsteps slow and careful on the path. She turned when she heard him approach, shielding her eyes against the brightness. "You come outside," he said. She nodded. "It's different out here." He sat down on the bench nearby, his movements stiff. She could see the effort it took him now, the subtle wince he tried to hide when he lowered himself. For a while, they said nothing. The wind moved gently through the leaves, stirring the air between them. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. Aisha glanced at him, studying the way his face had softened with time, how his eyes seemed more vulnerable now than they ever had before. "No," she said. She didn't need to explain further. He seemed to understand. The days continued like this, each one carrying her a little further away from the girl she had been when she first stepped into the car that had brought her here. She spent hours relearning the house, walking through rooms she had once only mapped in her mind. She sat in the conservatory and watched the light shift across the floor. She learned the faces of the staff, the maid's quiet smile, the gardener's lined, weathered expression. She listened to their voices and matched them now to the shapes she could finally see. And she watched him. There were days when he disappeared for hours, the staff moving quietly around her, their faces carefully blank. She knew then that he was with doctors, or resting behind the closed door of his study. She learned to recognize the signs of his illness, the pallor in his cheeks, the stiffness in his movements. He did not speak of it, and she did not press him. It was another truth between them, unspoken but present. One evening, she found herself standing in the music room, her fingers hovering over the piano keys. She pressed down gently, letting the note linger in the quiet space. She had listened to this piano for months, long before she knew what it looked like, what the polished wood felt like beneath her hands. Now she saw it fully, the worn edges, the faint scratches, the way the light caught on its surface. She sat there for a long time, playing simple, hesitant melodies, letting the sound fill the room. He stood in the doorway, watching her. She did not hear him enter, but when she looked up, their eyes met. "You've learned," he said softly. She nodded. "A little." He walked slowly to the chair across from her, sitting carefully. "You never asked me what I wanted when I brought you here," he said after a pause. Aisha's fingers stilled on the keys. "No?" "I didn't know myself," he admitted. "I thought I wanted someone who wouldn't see me, someone who wouldn't expect anything." She watched him, waiting. "But I think," he continued, "what I wanted was someone who would stay." Aisha looked down at the keys beneath her hands, then back at him. The man who had once seemed distant, unreachable, now sat before her, tired and worn, but more real than anyone she had ever known. "I'm still here," she said quietly. The months passed gently after that, time stretching soft and slow like the light through the conservatory windows. The seasons shifted, the sharp edges of summer softening into the cool hush of autumn. Aisha moved through the house now with ease, her footsteps light, her eyes open. She learned to see not just with her sight, but with all the ways she had known the world before. The rhythm of footsteps, the weight of silence, the shape of a breath in the air. And he watched her laugh quietly with the maid, watched her fingers trail over the petals in the garden, watched her play soft notes on the piano in the evenings. His illness grew heavier as the days grew colder. She could see it now, the way his hands trembled when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his shoulders sagged beneath the weight of something unseen. He spoke less, but when he did, it was with a gentleness she had not known possible. One afternoon, as the wind rustled dry leaves against the windows, she sat beside him in the study. The light was fading, casting long shadows across the floor. "You've changed everything," he said quietly. Aisha shook her head. "I've only seen what was already here." He reached for her hand then, his fingers rough and cool against hers. "Stay," he said. She closed her fingers around his. "I already have," she replied. And when the winter came, blanketing the garden in frost and stillness, she remained. Not as a wife bought and forgotten, not as the blind girl sold to a man she could not know, but as herself. A woman who had learned to see not just with her eyes, but with her heart. The house, too, seemed to change. It no longer echoed hollowly with emptiness. It breathed quietly now, filled with the subtle music of footsteps, of laughter, of shared silences. Aisha stood one morning by the window, watching the light spill across the floor. The world beyond the glass stretched wide and bright, a place she had once only imagined. And for the first time in her life, she saw herself not as something unwanted, not as something broken, but as someone who belonged. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters and other videos on this channel. Watch the next video to continue the journey, and check out the others for more powerful stories. And if you think someone else would enjoy this, share it with them. It helps the channel grow.